Frank Calloway was 38 years old when his wife looked him in the eye across their kitchen table and told him she was done. She set her coffee cup down, folded her hands, and said, "I filed the papers on Tuesday. You'll get them tomorrow." That was it. No raised voice. No dramatic exit. She simply stood up, straightened her blouse, picked up a suitcase that had already been packed and placed near the door, and walked out of the house they had shared for 11 years. Frank sat there in the kitchen for a long time after that. The coffee he had poured for himself had gone cold. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink, landing on the spot where she always stood when she was cooking, and Frank just looked at that spot for a while. He didn't say anything. There was no one left to say anything to. Before we go any further into this story, welcome to Mason Storyvault. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know if you're watching from Texas, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, or somewhere else entirely. This one is going to hit different. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what Frank didn't know sitting at that table was that the worst day of his life was already the first day of the greatest chapter of it. Frank and Cecilia had met when they were both 26 years old at a mutual friend's cookout in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was bright, sharp, and had a way of making everyone in a room feel like she had singled them out specifically. Frank was drawn to that about her. He was a steady, quiet man who worked as a mechanical technician at a mid-sized manufacturing plant on the west side of the city. He was good at his job, methodical, and he showed up every single day without complaint. He wasn't the kind of man who made bold declarations about his future. He just worked. And for the first several years of their marriage, that was enough. They bought a modest house in the Norwood neighborhood. They had a routine. They built something small but real. But Cecilia had always wanted more than small. She never said it directly in the beginning, but it was there, underneath everything. The vacations she pinned on Pinterest that they couldn't afford. The neighborhoods she drove through slowly when they were running errands. Looking at the bigger houses with a certain quiet hunger that Frank noticed, but never addressed directly. He thought if he just kept working, kept building, the gap between where they were and where she wanted to be would close eventually. It never did. And the harder things got financially, the wider that gap felt to Cecilia. Frank's plant had gone through 2 rounds of layoffs, and while he survived both of them, his hours were cut significantly. They had burned through most of their savings during the second year of cuts. Frank picked up side work wherever he could, weekend repair jobs, helping a buddy with a contracting business on off days, anything that kept money coming in. He never complained about it. He just did it. But Cecilia had started looking at their life differently by that point. She had started measuring it against other people's lives and finding it lacking. Frank knew things were shifting between them, but he kept telling himself they would get through it. He had no idea she had already made her decision. His name was Roland Hatch, 51 years old, divorced twice, and the owner of a commercial real estate company based out of downtown Cincinnati with satellite offices in Columbus and Louisville. He wore custom suits and drove a black Mercedes that he traded in every 18 months. He had met Cecilia at a charity fundraiser she attended with a girlfriend, and within 3 months, she had decided that Roland Hatch was what her life was supposed to look like. She didn't tell Frank about Roland when she left. She just cited irreconcilable differences in the divorce papers, listed a few vague complaints about growing apart, and moved her things out over the course of a weekend while Frank was doing a contracting job across town. When Frank came home that Sunday evening, her closet was empty. Her toiletries were gone from the bathroom. The framed photo of their wedding day that had sat on the dresser was gone, but the nail hole in the wall was still there. Frank stood in front of that empty space for a long time. He found out about Roland 6 weeks later from Cecilia's cousin, Patrice, who had never been comfortable with the situation and felt Frank deserved to know the truth. Patrice called him on a Thursday evening and told him as gently as she could that Cecilia had been seeing Roland for about 5 months before the papers were filed. Frank thanked her for telling him. He hung up the phone, went to the kitchen, opened a beer, and sat down at the table again. Same table, same chair, different silence. He didn't call Cecilia. He didn't show up at Roland's office. He didn't do any of the things that might have made sense to a man who had just been told his marriage ended for a reason he was never given. He just sat there and let it settle. That was Frank's nature. He processed things slowly and completely, and then he moved. His old friend and former co-worker, Dennis Ray, checked in on him regularly during those months. Dennis was the kind of man who didn't need to say much to communicate that he was there. He'd show up on a Saturday with a six-pack, and they'd watch football and barely talk about the actual problem, and somehow that was exactly what Frank needed. The divorce was finalized on a cold morning in February. Because they had no children and the house was mortgaged beyond what it was currently worth, the settlement was straightforward. Frank kept the house and took on the remaining mortgage. Cecilia waived any claim to it in exchange for Frank taking on the shared credit card debt, which amounted to just over $14,000. His attorney, a practical woman named Opal Reeves who had handled the whole thing with clean efficiency, told Frank it wasn't the worst deal she'd seen, but it wasn't a good one either. Frank told her he understood, signed where she told him to sign, and walked out of the courthouse alone. He stopped at a gas station on the way home. He was running low on fuel and low on everything else. He had exactly $22 in his wallet. He pumped $15 of gas and stood at the counter while the cashier ran his card. While he was waiting, he looked at the lottery display on the counter. It was a Tuesday, and the Ohio State Lottery jackpot had rolled over 5 consecutive times. The posted number on the sign behind the register read $52 million. Frank stared at that number for a moment. Then he bought a $5 quick pick ticket and put it in his jacket pocket without thinking much about it at all. He thought about it on Saturday when he was sitting at his kitchen table with Dennis, going through a pile of bills. Dennis had brought food this time, a bag from a diner they both liked, and they were eating and not really talking much when Frank pulled the ticket out of his jacket pocket and set it on the table between the food containers. He had forgotten about it until he found it in the jacket when he was looking for his work gloves. Dennis looked at it. "You checked that?" Frank shook his head. Dennis picked up his phone, opened the lottery app, and typed in the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the phone down and looked at Frank with an expression Frank had never seen on Dennis's face before. Dennis was not a man who showed surprise easily. Frank looked at him. Dennis picked the phone back up and double-checked it. Then he set it down again and said, "Frank, you need to look at this." Frank looked at the numbers on the phone. Then he looked at the ticket. Then he looked at the phone again. He didn't say anything for a full minute. Dennis was watching him the whole time. Finally, Frank set the ticket down on the table very carefully, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled slowly. The jackpot was $52 million. Every single number matched. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I'm still here," because this story is just getting started and the most devastating part hasn't even happened yet. This is the kind of story you tell people about. Frank did not call anyone. He did not post anything. He did not take a photo of the ticket and send it to family. He put the ticket in an envelope, put the envelope in a fireproof lockbox he kept in the bedroom closet, and spent the next 2 days researching exactly what to do. Dennis was the only person who knew, and Frank made him promise silence without having to explain why. Dennis understood. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Frank contacted Opal Reeves the following week. He told her he needed to discuss something unrelated to the divorce and asked if she handled matters beyond family law. She referred him to her colleague, a financial and estate attorney named Robert Gaines, whose office was in a quiet building in Hyde Park. Frank met with Robert on a Wednesday morning, told him exactly what had happened, and they spent 4 hours going through every option available to him. Ohio allows lottery winners to remain anonymous through the use of a trust. Robert recommended a blind trust, and Frank agreed without hesitation. The trust was structured and named before Frank ever made a single public claim. The lottery winnings were claimed through the trust. The announcement that appeared in the state lottery's required disclosure listed a trust name, no individual. In Ohio, the winner's identity was shielded completely. Frank's name appeared nowhere. He quit his job at the plant on a Friday. He told his supervisor he had found another opportunity. No one asked many questions because Frank had always been the kind of man who kept his personal life private. He paid off the mortgage on the house in full within the first 30 days. He paid off the credit card debt he had taken on from the divorce. He set aside a structured investment portfolio that Robert had helped him design, heavy in index funds and municipal bonds, conservative and deliberate, nothing flashy. He set up a separate operating fund for personal expenses that was comfortable but not outrageous. He was not a man who needed a yacht or a private jet or a watch that cost more than some people's cars. What he did do was quietly buy a second property, a well-maintained brick house in the Indian Hill area of Cincinnati, one of the more established and respected neighborhoods in the city. Not a mansion, a solid, beautiful house with a proper yard and a workshop in the back where he could actually work on mechanical projects, which was something he genuinely loved. He moved in 4 months after the divorce was finalized. Over the following 8 months, Frank did something that most people who receive a sudden fortune fail to do. He built a structure around himself. With Robert's guidance and Dennis's help sourcing contacts, Frank quietly became a silent partner in 2 local businesses. One was a mid-sized auto repair and parts distribution company in Dayton that was profitable but underfunded and looking for a capital partner. The other was a small commercial property in Columbus that needed renovation and a competent owner. Frank threw himself into both with the same methodical attention he had given to his work at the plant. He learned. He asked questions. He read everything Robert put in front of him. He was not trying to become wealthy in a visible way. He was trying to become stable in a permanent way, and there is a significant difference between those two things. Dennis came on as a paid consultant on the Dayton operation, which gave him a meaningful income for the first time in years. Frank didn't make a show of it. He just made the call. What he didn't do during any of those months was think about Cecilia. Or more precisely, he made a deliberate decision not to build his daily life around what had happened with her. He had processed the betrayal in the quiet, thorough way he processed everything, and he had arrived at a conclusion. She had made a choice. People make choices. The choice she made had told him everything he needed to know about who she actually was, which was different from who he had believed her to be. That distinction mattered to Frank. He wasn't angry in a consuming way. He was clear. There's a difference. And that clarity was what allowed him to move forward without the kind of bitterness that eats men alive. Roland Hatch, as it turned out, was not the man Cecilia had believed him to be either. The commercial real estate business that looked so impressive from the outside had been operating on a combination of leveraged debt and investor money that Roland had been managing with increasing desperation for nearly 2 years before Cecilia entered his life. He was good at projecting success. He had the car and the suits and the downtown office and the ability to take Cecilia to the kinds of dinners and events that made her feel like she had arrived somewhere important. For about 9 months, it was everything she had imagined. Roland was attentive and generous and spoke about the future with confident authority. She moved into his condo in the Columbia Tusculum neighborhood, and for a while her life felt exactly like the life she had been trying to build with Frank, except with better furniture and a better address. The first sign that something was wrong came when Roland missed a dinner reservation and arrived home at midnight looking like he had aged 5 years in one day. He said it was business stress. She accepted that. The second sign came 3 weeks later when two men in suits arrived at the condo on a Saturday morning, and Roland took them into his home office and closed the door and stayed in there for over an hour. When they left, Cecilia asked who they were. Roland said they were consultants. She would later find out they were attorneys representing a group of investors who had begun to question the financial statements Roland had provided them. The third sign came when Roland's personal credit card was declined at a restaurant where they had taken another couple to dinner, and Roland covered it smoothly with cash and explained it away as a bank error. But Cecilia had seen the look that passed across his face in the half-second before he composed himself, and that look was fear. By the time Cecilia fully understood what she was in the middle of, the situation had progressed significantly. Roland's company was facing a civil lawsuit from a group of investors alleging that he had misrepresented the financial performance of several commercial properties. The lawsuit was detailed and well documented, and the preliminary legal filings that Patrice found online and quietly forwarded to Cecilia made clear that Roland had known about the losses for well over a year and had continued to bring in new investors during that period. The word in the filing that stopped Cecilia cold was fraud, not a vague allegation, a specific, detailed claim supported by records. Roland's attorneys were fighting it, but the discovery process had begun and things were being disclosed that could not be undisclosed. The condo was mortgaged. The Mercedes was leased. The custom suits meant nothing. And the man who had worn them with such authority had started coming home with a hardness in his face that had nothing to do with stress and everything to do with the specific anxiety of a man who knows he is running out of options. Cecilia moved out in March. She had nowhere obvious to go. Her parents were elderly and living in a small house in Covington, Kentucky, and that was not a situation she could see herself walking back into. She stayed briefly with a friend from work, and during those 2 weeks, she had a lot of time to sit in a borrowed guest room and think about the sequence of decisions she had made over the past 2 years. And it was during that thinking, in that room, that Patrice called her again. Patrice had a habit of knowing things before other people did, and what she had found out this time was that a trust connected to a mechanical and real estate holding group based in Cincinnati had been identified by a local business reporter working on a story about quiet capital moving into the Dayton industrial corridor. The reporter had traced the trust through public business filings and had made a connection that, while not published yet, had circulated in a small number of local business circles. Patrice had heard it from a friend whose husband worked in commercial banking. The trust, she explained carefully, was believed to be controlled by a private individual who had come into significant money within the past year. And the name that was being quietly associated with the trust, not publicly, not officially, but in the way that real information moves through a city, was Frank Calloway. Cecilia sat on the edge of the guest bed with the phone pressed to her ear and didn't say anything for a long time after Patrice finished talking. Patrice didn't push. She just waited. Finally, Cecilia said, "Are you sure?" And Patrice said, "No, but it's more than a rumor." Cecilia asked how much money. Patrice said she had heard a number, but didn't want to say it because she thought Cecilia should hear it from someone more reliable. But she told her anyway, and that number was $52 million. Cecilia set the phone down on the bed after they hung up and sat there in that room for a very long time. She called Frank 3 days later. He let it ring. She called again the next morning. He picked up on the fourth ring and said, "Cecilia," not as a question, just as a fact. She asked if she could see him. He asked what for. She said she wanted to talk, that a lot had happened, and she thought they should talk in person. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can do Thursday at 2 o'clock. He gave her the address in Indian Hill. She wrote it down. She arrived 8 minutes early, which told Frank everything. He had asked Dennis to come that day, not for backup, but because Frank believed in having a witness for conversations that mattered. Dennis sat in the kitchen with coffee while Frank answered the door. Cecilia stood on the front porch of the brick house and looked at Frank, and then she looked past him at the interior, at the clean hardwood floors, and the proper furniture and the light from the large rear windows, and she took a breath and said, "You look good." Frank said, "Come in." He brought her to the living room and sat across from her in a chair. He didn't offer coffee. He waited. She spent several minutes working up to it, talking around the actual point, mentioning how hard the past year had been, mentioning Roland without using his name, using phrases like, "I made mistakes," and "I've done a lot of thinking." Frank listened. He didn't nod in encouragement. He didn't fill her silences. He just let her talk until she ran out of the careful preamble and arrived at the actual thing she had come to say, which was that she missed what they had, that she had made a terrible mistake, that she knew it would take time, but she wanted to know if there was any possibility of finding their way back to each other. She said it with her eyes on him, and for a moment Frank thought she might actually believe it herself. He let the room stay quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I appreciate you saying that." She looked at him, and he could see a small opening of hope in her expression, and he continued, "But I don't think you're describing what we had. I think you're describing what you hoped I could provide." He said it without heat, without cruelty, just as a clear and accurate observation. She started to respond, and he held up one hand, just slightly, and she stopped. He said, "You didn't leave because we grew apart. You left because you decided I wasn't going to give you the life you wanted. And that's a choice you had every right to make. But I'm not available to be the option you come back to when the other choice didn't work out." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without discomfort. Then she said, "So that's it." He said, "That's it." She stood up. She smoothed her jacket, the same habit she had always had when she was trying to compose herself. She walked to the door, and Frank walked with her. She stepped onto the porch and then turned around once more and said, "I heard things. About money." Frank looked at her. "I hope things work out for you, Cecilia," he said. And he closed the door. Dennis was standing in the kitchen doorway when Frank came back in. He didn't say anything. Frank picked up his coffee, took a sip, looked out the back window at the yard, and said, "She came back for the wrong reasons." Dennis said, "I know." Frank said, "I know you know." And that was the end of that conversation. Roland Hatch settled the investor lawsuit 18 months later for an amount that, according to public court records, was substantial enough to result in the dissolution of his company and the forced sale of his remaining personal assets. He avoided criminal charges through the settlement agreement, but his name in Cincinnati's business community was finished in any meaningful way. The Mercedes was gone. The condo was gone. He relocated to somewhere in the Carolinas, and no one in Frank's circle tracked what happened after that. Frank didn't track it either. He had things to do. The Dayton operation had expanded and was now supplying parts to 3 regional manufacturers. The Columbus property had been renovated, leased to a medical practice, and appraised at nearly double what Frank had paid for it. Robert Gaines had recommended 2 additional investment opportunities that Frank was reviewing carefully. Dennis had hired 2 full-time staff for the Dayton office and was talking about opening a satellite location. And on Sunday afternoons, Frank went into the workshop behind his house in Indian Hill and worked on an old engine he had picked up from an estate sale, just because he liked the work, because there was something he found genuinely satisfying about taking something apart and understanding how it worked and putting it back together correctly. He wasn't performing contentment. He was just content. And for a man who had been sitting in a cold kitchen 11 months earlier watching his life walk out the door with a packed suitcase, that was not a small thing. Opal Reeves called him one afternoon in October to close out a minor administrative matter from the divorce file. At the end of the call, she asked, off the record, how he was doing. He said he was doing well. She said good. She said she had seen enough of these situations to know that the person left sitting in the courthouse alone usually had a harder road ahead. Frank said that was generally probably true. She said she was glad it hadn't gone that way for him. Frank said, "Me too." He meant it. There was no satisfaction in Cecilia's situation. He wasn't tracking her pain as a form of victory. Her life was her business. What had happened, and he had chosen, very deliberately, not to carry it with him into what came next. That was the actual decision that mattered. Not the lottery ticket, not the trust, not the properties or the investments. The decision to put it down and walk forward without it. Everything else was just work, and Frank Calloway had never been afraid of work. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, then you already know this wasn't just about money. It was about what a person decides to do when everything they built gets taken away from them. It was about the quiet kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. Drop a comment right now and tell us what you thought about Frank's decision to close that door. Was he right? Should he have given her another chance? Hit the like button if this story moved you, and if you're not subscribed yet, do it right now and hit that notification bell, because we have more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Real, human, heavy stories about the choices people make and what those choices cost them. We'll see you in the next one.